Now, the US President Donald Trump's tariffs are complicating global trade, with critics calling them arbitrary and not based on economic reality. The latest round takes effect today with tariffs on wood products. Trump says he wants to protect the domestic forestry industry. Current countries that have already signed trade agreements with the US, like the EU, the UK and Japan, will face only the general tariff rate of 15%. Meanwhile, Trump has taken aim at China's dominance in world shipping, imposing a new port fees on Chinese ships that dock in US ports. Beijing has responded with its own charges for US vessels.
The port of Long Beach. The US charges a fee every time a Chinese-built ship docks at any US harbor. $50 per ton if it's owned by a Chinese company, and $18 if it's owned by a non-Chinese company. The fee will increase each year for the next 3 years. It's a first-of-a-kind measure meant to counter China's shipbuilding dominance and protect American shipyards. This dominance is real. Data from the UN shows that China delivered 54.6% of all new ship capacity in 2024. The next biggest producer is South Korea. This means a huge portion of the world fleet could be affected by the US fee.
Well, it's an absolute first that we see a country introducing docking fees on Chinese-built ships, and we expect a heavy impact on the shipping market. The first activity you will see is that ships built in China will go out of trade from the United States.
In other words, carriers will reroute vessels to avoid US ports. There are plenty of other trade lines for those ships, but the disruption will be significant. The shipping data provider Alphaliner warned in September that the US port fees could cost up to $3.2 billion next year for the world's top 10 carriers. Meanwhile, China has announced retaliatory measures. Vessels owned or operated by American companies or individuals and ships built in the US or flying the American flag would be subject to a $56 per net ton fee per voyage if they dock in China.
All right, let's talk about this with Cassandra Sant from DW Business and co-host of DW's business podcast, The Dip. Good to see you, Cassandra. First of all, let's talk about the impact. How much of an impact are these tit-for-tat docking fees likely to have?
Yeah, I want to underline how dominant China is in the shipbuilding industry right now. Just under 55% of ships built last year were built by China. Compare that to 0.1% that were built by the US, right? That's 1/10 of 1%. The difference here is really massive. And this has been a long-term trend from the Chinese side. So when you're looking at fleets that are operating around the world, even if the company itself isn't Chinese, there's a good chance that a lot of those ships were built in China, not to mention there are many big companies that are operated by China itself that are in the shipping business, right? So when we're thinking about a company that is sending a ship, one of these really big container ships, and let's say it has 10,000 of these containers on board, the fees right now could top $1 million. And these fees are also, let's not forget, set to increase every year through 2028. So with tit-for-tat tariffs, essentially the fees being more or less one for one from both sides, we're really escalating here.
So we're talking about big money. This is, of course, all happening, isn't it, as the two leaders, President Trump and the Chinese President Xi, are getting set to meet in the coming weeks. So what does this all mean for the talks between the two leaders?
Yeah, global trade, I think because sometimes these shipping containers move where we don't see them, we forget how much shipping is a part of this. 80% of global goods trade moves on the water. So when we talk about things moving across borders, we're talking about the shipping industry here. So this is a really big impact in terms of setting the stage. One president of the World Shipping Association said that U.S. fees and the counter fees from China risk harming exporters, producers, and consumers at a time when global trade is already under pressure. So U.S. President Trump, he's tried to downplay some of the tensions with China here. He posted on social media over the weekend, "Don't worry about China, it will be fine," with 3 exclamation points, right? But that was only days after he was threatening 100% tariffs back on China and after China tightened export controls for rare earth minerals. So when we're thinking about this talk that's going to happen likely at the end of the month, that's a few weeks away, but a lot can change in that time. And what I'm going to be really interested to see is how much these two sides have learned about the other's negotiating tactics over what I think we can safely call only the first year of this trade war.
Right. Now, on top of the the docking fees. We've got this 10% US tariff on lumber, haven't we? Just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's 10% on raw lumber and 25% on finished goods. And it's really, today is kind of a double fee kind of a day here. But when we're thinking about raw wood, that's going to hit Canada the hardest because the vast majority in terms of value of raw wood that the US got last year was from Canada, about 11.5 billion USD there. But when we're talking about finished goods, things like furniture, bathroom cabinets, and so on, the top 3 countries for those kinds of goods are Mexico, Vietnam, and number 1 is China. So that's really going to affect the housing market. Sure, folks aren't going to necessarily in the US buy furniture so often, but they are going to notice this increase. But what I've been reading from analysts and industry insiders is that this is going to affect the housing market. Because sure, you need cabinets and bathroom vanities and so on to finish the house. But the US lumber is a big part of that. So if your lumber costs as a construction company are increasing, things could slow down. And that runs counter to what US President Trump promised, which is more affordable housing for Americans.
So we're talking about significant ripple effects. Cassandra Sant from DW Business. Cassandra, thank you so much.